The auctioneer's voice was dry, like the dust motes dancing in the long shafts of July's sunlight, cutting through the tall windows of the county annex. $100. A bid from the man in the front row, a man whose suit cost more than the cars most people had driven here. He represented the bank. The bank was selling the parcel to itself mostly, a formality, a clearing of the books on a piece of land nobody had wanted for 50 years, a foreclosure on the Miller place, a family long gone to dust and debt. This last piece, parcel 7B, was a ghost on the county map, a sliver of forgotten gravel running behind the old farms. The auctioneer, a man named Harris, who had done this for 30 years, did not expect the process to take more than 5 minutes. The banksman, whose name was Caldwell, had already won 3 other parcels this morning with the same bored, confident nod. He nodded now. 125, Caldwell said, his voice smooth. Harris's gavel hovered.
125 from the bank. Do I hear 150? Silence. The room was mostly full of the curious, a few local farmers, 2 real estate agents hoping for a bargain they knew would not materialize, and a handful of retirees with nothing better to do on a Tuesday. They watched the man from the bank. They knew how this worked. Harris began the final count. Going once. Caldwell straightened his tie. He glanced at his watch. He had a lunch meeting in the city. Going twice. He was already thinking about his steak, medium rare. The sound that came next was not supposed to happen. It was clear and high, not the low murmur of a seasoned bidder. $200. The voice came from the back of the room, near the door. Every head turned. Harris squinted, his gavel frozen in midair. The bank's lawyer, Caldwell, turned slowly, a look of mild irritation on his face. He expected to see a rival developer, perhaps some out-of-town speculator who hadn't done his homework.
He did not expect to see a boy. The boy looked to be about 14. He stood straight, hands in the pockets of his jeans. He was thin, with a mop of brown hair that fell over his forehead. He looked scared, but he held his ground. Beside him stood a man. The man was in his late 40s, dressed in clean work clothes. His hands were calloused, but his shirt was pressed. He held a long cardboard tube under one arm. He said nothing. He just watched. A pause. The room was utterly still. Caldwell let out a short, disbelieving laugh. He turned back to the auctioneer. Is that a valid bid? Harris looked uncertain. He looked at the boy, then at the man beside him. The man gave a slow, deliberate nod. Just once. The bid is valid, Harris said, his voice regaining its official cadence. I have $200 from the gentleman in the back. The word gentleman hung in the air, a strange fit for the boy who had spoken. Caldwell's amusement had vanished. It was replaced by a flicker of annoyance. This was a waste of his time. This was an inconvenience. He represented an institution. He was not here to be delayed by children. The man was Thomas Reed. The boy was his son, Leo. They had driven an hour to be here, and they had not spoken for the last 20 minutes of the drive. Thomas was not a man who used words when a look would do. He had placed a hand on his son's shoulder before they walked in. That was the whole of his instruction. Now he stood as still as the oak pillars holding up the annex ceiling. He watched Caldwell, the bank's man. He saw the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the confidence that came from always being in the right room on the right side of the table. He had seen men like Caldwell his entire life. Men who operated on the assumption that the paperwork was always in their favor because it always had been. Men who smiled before they listened. Thomas carried no briefcase. He had the cardboard tube, its ends capped with plastic, and a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket. In his truck, locked in the glove box, was a small, worn notebook. That was all. The people in the room, the silent chorus of neighbors and agents, shifted in their seats. They looked from the lawyer to the man and his boy. It was a strange tableau. On one side, the polished machinery of finance and law. On the other, a farmer and a 14-year-old boy with $200 of what was probably summer mowing money. They did not understand what they were seeing. They saw a nuisance bid, a strange act of defiance. They did not see the culmination of 28 years of patience. They did not see the weight of a promise made in 1969. Thomas looked past the lawyer, his eyes settling on the county clerk, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Gable, who sat at a small table to the side observing the proceedings. Her face was impassive. She had seen everything that could happen in this room, or so she thought. Thomas had spoken to her on the phone a week ago. Her voice had been tired, bureaucratic, but she had listened, and she had checked. That was all he had asked. He didn't argue. He walked forward, slow, controlled. Leo stayed by the door, a fixed point in the shifting currents of the room. Thomas was not there for the land, not really. He was there for a line on a map, and a line in a will. Some things had to be kept straight. To understand why, you have to go back. Not just the 3 weeks before, but decades. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas was at his kitchen table. It was nearly midnight. The only light came from the small lamp over the sink, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum. His wife was asleep. The house was quiet. In front of him was a shoebox. It was his father's. John Reed had died 2 years prior, and Thomas was finally sorting through the last of his papers.
It was a slow, methodical process. Tax returns from the 1970s, receipts for tractor parts, letters from his brother overseas during the war, and at the very bottom, in a long yellowed envelope, was the will. It was not the final will. That had been probated and settled long ago. This was an older one, from 1969, superseded by a newer version in the 90s. Thomas almost tossed it. It was legally meaningless, a historical curiosity. But something made him open it. His father was a precise man. He never did anything without a reason. The paper was thick, the typewritten words faded but clear. He read through the standard bequests, the farm to his wife, then to Thomas, the small savings to be divided. Then he saw it, a separate clause under the heading concerning Parcel 7B. The language was dense, legalistic, but clear enough. His father had drafted it himself with a mail-order law book.
It stipulated that the thin, half-mile strip of land behind the Miller farm, an old access road that had fallen into disuse, was subject to a specific condition. His father had helped the Millers out of a bind back in the 60s, giving them a small loan to keep their farm afloat. They had no money to repay him. Instead, they had made an agreement, a handshake deal, memorialized in this document. The Millers granted John Reed and his heirs, in perpetuity, a right of first refusal should the parcel ever be sold. The price was fixed, $1. The will also granted a prescriptive easement, ensuring access could never be blocked. Thomas read it twice. He went to his office and pulled out the old county survey maps his father had kept. There it was, Parcel 7B, a line drawn in his father's steady hand. He remembered walking that strip with his father as a boy. It was overgrown then, barely a path. He had asked what it was for. Some things you don't own, his father had said.
You just keep them straight for the next person. He looked back at the will. It had been properly witnessed and notarized, and at the bottom, a handwritten note. Filed with the county clerk, June 10th, 1969. The next morning, Thomas drove to the courthouse. He spent 4 hours in the records room, the air thick with the smell of decaying paper and binding glue. He found the filing. It was there, a ghost in the machine. A promise recorded and then forgotten, by everyone except the man who made it. The bank, in its foreclosure of the Miller property decades later, had done a standard title search. But a title search looks for liens, for debts. It doesn't look for promises hidden in the wills of long-dead neighbours. It was an oversight born of assumption, the kind of mistake institutions make. They forget the handshakes. They only remember the numbers. John Reed had been a quiet man, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full.
He'd learned surveying from his own father and could read the land like a book. He understood that a fence line was more than just wire and posts. It was a conversation between neighbours, an agreement that had to be maintained. He believed that a man's name on a piece of paper was a sacred thing. He had taught Thomas how to set a fence post, how to read a contract, how to look a man in the eye. He didn't talk about honour, he lived it. The deal with the Millers in 1969 had been an act of quiet grace. Old man Miller was proud, and he would have lost the farm before he took charity. John Reed knew that, so he framed it as a business deal, a clever bit of legal manoeuvring that preserved Miller's dignity. The $1 right of refusal was a fiction, a way for one farmer to help another without insult. It was a promise that Miller would never lose access to the back fields, and a guarantee that Reed's family would be the perpetual guardians of that promise. John Reed never mentioned it again.
It was done, filed. He planted it like a seed, knowing it might not sprout for 50 years. He was planting a tree for the next man to sit under. When Thomas found the will, he understood this wasn't about a strip of gravel. It wasn't about money. It was about his father's character, solidified in ink and filed away in the county's memory. The bank's foreclosure was not malicious, it was simply impersonal. It was the predictable outcome of a system that had no room for handshake agreements or $1 promises. For the bank, Parcel 7B was a line item on a ledger, a non-performing asset to be liquidated. For Thomas, it was the last conversation he would ever have with his father. It was a final instruction delivered across the decades. Honour the agreement. Keep the line straight. He brought his son Leo with him to the auction for a reason. A lesson needed to be witnessed. Some things couldn't be taught with words. They had to be seen. They had to be felt. The silence in the car, the weight of the moment in the auction room, the quiet confidence of his father standing against the man in the suit. These were the things Leo would remember. Thomas was not there to fight the bank. He was there to fulfill a duty, a son's duty. He felt no anger toward the lawyer, Caldwell. He was just a man doing his job. But Thomas was there to do his too, and his job that day was to remember what everyone else had forgotten. Back in the room, the air was thick with tension. Caldwell, the bank's lawyer, looked at Thomas, then at the boy, then back at the auctioneer. His professional calm was fraying at the edges. $250, he said, his voice sharp. The auctioneer turned his gaze to the back of the room. I have $250 from the bank, sir? He was looking at Thomas now, not the boy. Leo looked at his father. Thomas gave another small, almost imperceptible nod. 300, Leo said.
His voice was a little shaky now, but it was clear. The room murmured. This was no longer amusing. It was becoming a contest. Caldwell's face tightened. He was being played with, and he did not like it. He took a step forward. Mr. Harris, he said, addressing the auctioneer directly, his tone laced with authority. I must insist we verify the bidder's capacity to pay. This is a legal auction, not a schoolyard game. It was his first real move, an argument from procedure. He was trying to disqualify them, to sweep them aside with the rules that always protected men like him. Harris, the auctioneer, looked uncomfortable. It was a reasonable request. He looked at Thomas. Sir, do you have the funds to cover your bid? Thomas said nothing.
He walked forward from the back of the room, his work boots making a soft, steady sound on the worn floorboards. Leo stayed put. Thomas walked past the rows of seated onlookers, past the bank's lawyer, and stopped at the auctioneer's podium.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small roll of cash held together by a rubber band.
He laid it on the podium. There were 3 $100 bills. He then reached into his other pocket and took out a folded paper. He unfolded it and placed it next to the money. It was a notarized statement signed by him granting his son, Leo Reed, the legal right to bid on his behalf. A simple affidavit. He had done his homework. He had anticipated this challenge. He had prepared for it. He did not speak. He let the documents speak for him. Harris, the auctioneer, looked at the cash. He picked up the affidavit and read it. He looked over at Mrs. Gable, the county clerk, who gave a slight nod. The document was in order. "The bid stands," Harris announced. "The bid is $300. Caldwell's face was now a mask of cold fury. He had been rebuffed. His authority questioned and dismissed, not with an argument, but with a quiet, undeniable fact. The farmer had come prepared.
This was not a random act. This was planned. The room felt it. The dynamic had shifted. The quiet man was no longer just a spectator. He was a player, and he seemed to know the rules of the game better than the lawyer did. Caldwell was a man used to controlling the narrative. He did it in depositions, in boardrooms, in courtrooms. He did it with language, with posture, with the sheer force of his professional standing. Now, in this stuffy, sun-baked room, he was losing control. His first attempt, the procedural block, had failed. He moved to a second angle, an argument from superior knowledge. He straightened his jacket, a gesture meant to reestablish his authority. He addressed Thomas directly, though his voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Sir, I'm not sure you understand what this property is. Parcel 7B is a landlocked, undeveloped strip of gravel. It has no water access, no utilities. It has a taxable value of less than $500.
Our bid is a formality. Your bid is irrational." He was trying to paint Thomas as a fool, an ignorant farmer wasting everyone's time. He was asserting the bank's expertise. "We have performed an exhaustive title search, a full survey and a commercial appraisal. The title is clean. The parcel is unencumbered. There are no pending claims or liens." He said the words exhaustive and unencumbered with a kind of finality, as if they were walls that could not be breached. He was daring Thomas to disagree with the full weight of the bank's due diligence. Thomas did not take the dare. He did not argue about the appraisal or the survey. He simply stood there, his hands resting at his sides. He let the lawyer's words hang in the air and then die. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "You're right," he said it to the auctioneer, not to Caldwell. "It's not worth much." A pause. "But the title is not clear." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "That is factually incorrect, sir." He was losing his composure, the "sir" sounding more like an insult than a courtesy. He moved to his third and final argument, the last resort of a man who was lost on procedure and fact. An appeal to common sense, edged with intimidation. "What possible claim could you have? This foreclosure has been public record for 6 months. If there was an issue, it would have been raised through proper legal channels, not at the last second in a public auction." He was implying that Thomas was an amateur, an ambusher, breaking the gentleman's rules of legal conflict. He was trying to shame him into backing down. The room was silent. Everyone was looking at Thomas. They were waiting for his argument, for his grand reveal. Thomas looked at Caldwell. Then he looked at the auctioneer. "I believe the sale is predicated on a clear title." He spoke the words as a simple statement of fact. Harris nodded. "That's correct. All sales are final, but they assume clear title." Then the title is not clear, Thomas repeated, and the issue was raised. In 1969, a space had been cleared in the centre of the room, a circle of quiet tension. With Thomas Reed and the bank's lawyer at its core, everyone else was a spectator. Caldwell's confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle anger. He had built his case on the solid ground of modern banking and property law. He believed his paperwork was scripture. The quiet farmer kept talking about 1969 as if it mattered, as if a handshake from a time of black and white television could have any bearing on a digital foreclosure in the 21st century. It was absurd. "This is a waste of time," Caldwell said, turning to the auctioneer. "I demand we proceed with the sale. The man has presented no evidence, no documentation, no legal standing. Just a year." Thomas turned his head slightly, his gaze falling once more on Mrs. Eleanor Gable, the county clerk. She had been sitting perfectly still this whole time, her hands folded on her small wooden table. She was the institutional memory of this county. She was the neutral ground. The room waited. Mrs. Gable did not move. Caldwell followed Thomas's gaze. He looked at the clerk. "Mrs. Gable, do you know anything about this?" His tone was dismissive. He assumed she was just a functionary, a keeper of records. He did not understand that in a small town, the keeper of records is the keeper of history, the keeper of promises. Mrs. Gable blinked once. She looked at Thomas, then at the lawyer. A long silence stretched. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly against a window pane. A man in the second row slowly put his phone down on the seat beside him. A chair scraped against the floor. Finally, Mrs. Gable spoke. Her voice was soft, but it filled the room. "The issue is recorded in the will of John Reed. It was filed in this county on June 10th, 1969. Caldwell stared at her. "Filed? What was filed?"
A will is a private testamentary document. It has no bearing on a real estate transaction between other parties. He was clinging to the letter of the law he knew. "You are mistaken," he said. Mrs. Gable did not argue. She simply rose from her chair. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She walked out of the auction room through a side door that led to the records office. The door clicked shut behind her. The room was left in a state of suspended animation. No one spoke. Caldwell stood frozen, his legal arguments useless against a closed door. Thomas waited, his posture unchanged. He had known it would come to this. He had known the truth was not in his pocket or in his words, but in the county's own books. It had to be verified by a neutral party. It had to be brought into the light by the institution itself. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. Caldwell checked his watch again, but this time it was a nervous gesture. He was no longer in a hurry to get to lunch.
He was in a room where the rules he understood had ceased to function. The side door opened. Mrs. Gable returned. She was carrying a large, heavy book bound in faded red leather. It was a county ledger, thick with the weight of decades. She placed it on her table with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet room. She opened it to a page marked with a thin strip of paper. She ran her finger down the typewritten lines, a public record of a private promise. She did not look up. She simply read one sentence aloud. "The will of John Reed, recorded on this date, grants a permanent prescriptive easement across parcel 7B to his property, and further grants his heirs a right of first refusal to purchase said parcel for the sum of $1, contingent upon the property ever being offered for public or private sale by any future owner." The sentence landed in the room with the force of a gavel. Done. It was over. The air went out of Caldwell. His shoulders, which had been squared with indignation, slumped. He looked at the ledger, then at the old woman, then at the quiet farmer. He had built a fortress of paperwork, of modern procedure, and a single sentence from 1969 had dismantled it entirely. The bank did not have a clear title. They were attempting to sell something they did not fully own the rights to. The auction was invalid. The room remained silent. No one celebrated. No one gloated. The farmers and the real estate agents just watched. They were witnessing a rare thing, a quiet truth winning a loud argument. Caldwell cleared his throat. His professional composure returned, a mask sliding back into place. He was in damage control mode now. He turned to Thomas, and for the first time, he looked at him as an equal. His voice was low, conciliatory. "Sir, Mr. Reed, clearly there has been a significant, historical oversight. An artifact of an old agreement that our title search regrettably did not uncover."
He was trying to frame it as a mutual problem, a clerical error to be solved between reasonable men. "Perhaps we can discuss a settlement. The bank is prepared to be generous to clear this encumbrance. For your trouble, for the quitclaim." He was offering money. It was the only tool he had left. He was a banker's lawyer. Every problem had a price. He named a number, $5,000, a significant sum for a worthless piece of land. He thought he was making a generous offer. He thought he was buying his way out of the problem. He did not understand the currency of the transaction. Thomas did not look at the lawyer. He did not acknowledge the offer. He looked at his son, Leo, who was still standing by the door, watching everything. Then he looked at the auctioneer, Harris. He spoke clearly. The bid was $300. Harris, confused, said, "The auction is void, Mr. Reed. There is a right of first refusal," Thomas interrupted gently. "Recorded, verified." "The price is stipulated." He paused. "The price is $1. Caldwell's face went pale. He finally understood. This was not a negotiation. It was not about money. It was about the letter of a very old law, a law written by a father for his son. It was about a promise. He had come with a briefcase full of money and legal precedent. Thomas Reed had come with $1 and a memory. And the memory had won. There was nothing left to say. The bank had no more arguments. Their position had been dismantled piece by piece, not with anger, but with quiet, patient fact. The resolution was as quiet as the man who had forced it. Caldwell, the lawyer, did not argue further. He did not make a scene. He simply nodded once, a sharp, defeated gesture. He picked up his leather briefcase from the chair where he had left it. He snapped the latches shut. The sound was unnervingly loud in the still room. He buttoned his suit jacket. He turned and walked out of the county annex without looking at anyone. No villain's monologue. No final parting shot. He just left, a man erased from a story he thought he was writing. The auction was over. Harris, the auctioneer, cleared his throat. "This proceeding is concluded," he announced to the room. The onlookers, the silent chorus, began to stir. They stood up, scraping chairs, murmuring to one another. They filed out, glancing at Thomas Reed as they passed. They still didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew they had seen something important. A small thing made large. A quiet man who had stood his ground and been proven right. Thomas Reed walked to the clerk's table where Mrs. Gable still sat with the large red ledger open. He took a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He opened it and took out a single crisp $1 bill. He placed it carefully on the open page of the ledger, right next to the clause his father had written 50 years before. Mrs. Gable took the dollar. She wrote out a receipt on a small pad of paper, a pen scratching softly. Her handwriting was a beautiful old-fashioned script. She tore the sheet off and handed it to Thomas. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket. He then turned to his son.
Leo came forward, his eyes wide. Thomas laid the cardboard tube he had been carrying on the table. He uncapped one end and slid out a rolled-up map. He unrolled it. It was a survey of the local farms, hand-drawn by his father in 1968. The lines were drawn in precise black ink. The lettering was neat, architectural. He showed Leo the thin strip of land marked Parcel 7B. He took a small pencil from his pocket, the kind a carpenter uses. He made a small, neat check mark on the parcel. Then he wrote a date next to it. Today's date. He rolled the map back up, his movements slow and deliberate. He put the cap back on the tube. He picked it up. He looked at Mrs. Gable. "Thank you, Eleanor." She gave him a small, rare smile.
Your father was a good man, Thomas.
He nodded once. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, and they walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. There was no celebration. There was no triumph. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a job done. A line kept straight. A promise kept. Later that day, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. Thomas and Leo were walking. They were on the narrow strip of land, the gravel crunching under their boots. For years it had been a forgotten line on a map, a place for weeds to grow. Now it was something else. It was a story. They walked the half-mile length of it from the county road to the back pasture of their own farm. They didn't talk. They just walked, listening to the sound of the wind in the tall grass. At the far end, they stopped at a fence line. The posts were old cedar, weathered to a soft grey, set by his father's own hands. Leo leaned against one.
He had been quiet all afternoon, processing what he had seen. The confident lawyer, his father's calm, the old book, the $1. He finally spoke. "Why did Grandpa want us to have it? It's just rocks and weeds." Thomas looked out over the land, his father's land. He picked up a flat, smooth stone from the ground, turning it over in his calloused palm. "He didn't want us to have it," he said. "He wanted us to make sure it was never taken. He wanted to make sure the Millers, or whoever came after them, could never be boxed in. It wasn't about owning it. It was about making sure it stayed open. It was a gate, a promise that there would always be a way through." He looked at his son. "Some things you don't own, you just take care of them. You keep them straight for the next person." Leo nodded slowly. He understood. He was 14 years old, and he had just seen a battle won without a single punch being thrown. He had seen the power of a piece of paper, of a promise kept across a generation. He had learned a lesson about patience, about preparation, and about a kind of strength that didn't need to raise its voice. They stood there for a long time as the light faded. Two figures on a thin line of gravel, guarding a promise they now shared. Some men collect problems. Thomas Reed collected patience. It's a rare currency, but it spends well in rooms where no one else has any. If a father's promise from 1969 can change a foreclosure in an instant, what can a forgotten stamp on a deed from 1924 do to a modern skyscraper? We'll see what holds. Stay with us.